I was assigned to Supreme Leader Kylo Ren's personal detail for 73 days before I understood that the conflict everyone whispered about wasn't a struggle between good and evil, but something far worse, something that made the binary choice between light and dark seem like a mercy compared to what he was actually experiencing. My name is Lieutenant Jason Korvax, First Order Naval Intelligence, Psychological Operations Division, and I need to record what I witnessed before they reassign me to some frontier posting where accidents happen to personnel who've seen too much. The Supreme Leader's inner conflict isn't what the Resistance propaganda claims, isn't what our own training materials suggest, isn't even what I think Supreme Leader Ren himself believes it is. It's something older and stranger and more horrifying than a simple choice between his grandfather's legacy and his parents' hope. They selected me for the detail because of my psychological profile, because I'd scored high on empathy indices while maintaining perfect loyalty metrics, because I could observe emotional states in command personnel without letting those observations compromise my service. The First Order needed someone close to Supreme Leader Ren who could document his mental state for operational planning purposes, who could provide early warning if his instability started affecting his command decisions, who could quietly report on whether the Supreme Leader was fit to lead or whether contingency protocols needed activation. I was that someone, chosen from a pool of 300 candidates, vetted through 17 different evaluations, briefed on protocols I'm still not supposed to discuss, and given a datapad that I was to update daily with observations about Supreme Leader Ren's psychological condition. They told me during the briefing that Supreme Leader Ren experienced conflict between the light and dark sides of the Force, that this conflict was natural for someone with his bloodline, that it didn't compromise his effectiveness as a leader, but required monitoring to ensure it remained manageable. They showed me footage of him destroying equipment during fits of rage, records of subordinates killed for failures, documentation of his unpredictable command style. They explained that these were symptoms of his struggle, manifestations of the internal war between his training under Supreme Leader Snoke and the pull toward the light that his family connection created. They made it sound clinical, understandable, like monitoring any other medical condition that might affect a commander's performance. What they didn't tell me was that the conflict wasn't psychological, it was ontological. Supreme Leader Ren wasn't struggling to choose between light and dark. He was being torn apart by the fact that both were trying to inhabit the same person simultaneously, that his existence had become a battlefield where two incompatible aspects of the Force were fighting for dominance, neither able to fully control him, neither willing to relinquish their claim. He wasn't choosing. He was being chosen repeatedly by forces that were using him as their instrument in a war that had been going on since before the Jedi and Sith codified the conflict into philosophies and religions. I realized this on my 4th day assigned to his personal detail. We were aboard the Finalizer, preparing for an operation against a resistance cell in the Wraith system, and I was present during a tactical briefing in the Supreme Leader's command chamber. The chamber was sparse, decorated only with the melted remains of Darth Vader's helmet in a reliquary and meditation furniture that showed signs of violent damage. Supreme Leader Ren stood before the holotable displaying the target system, his mask on, his presence radiating that peculiar pressure that Force users create in the space around them. The tactical officers were presenting assault vectors when the Supreme Leader suddenly went rigid, his gloved hands gripping the table's edge hard enough that I heard the metal groan. Everyone in the room froze. We'd been briefed on the possibility of the Supreme Leader's episodes, taught to remain silent and still when they occurred, warned that interference could be fatal. But this wasn't the rage we'd been prepared for. Supreme Leader Ren's head tilted back slightly, and through his mask, I heard breathing that didn't match the vocoder's rhythm, something irregular and pained. Then he spoke, but not to us, not to anyone visible in the room. He said, "I know what you want. I've always known. But I can't be that." His voice was younger than normal, less certain, almost pleading. A moment later he straightened, his posture changing completely, becoming more aggressive, and he said, in his usual processed tone, "Sentiment is weakness. The past is dead. There is only power." But the voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I realized I was hearing two different people speaking through the same mouth, two different consciousnesses struggling for control of the same vocal apparatus. The tactical officers pretended not to notice, continuing their briefing as soon as the Supreme Leader gestured for them to proceed. But I'd seen it, heard it, felt the way the pressure in the room had fluctuated during those few seconds, like reality itself was uncertain about which version of Kylo Ren was supposed to exist. I made a note in my observation log, carefully clinical wording about emotional volatility and command presence fluctuation. But privately, I understood I'd witnessed something that shouldn't be possible. Someone who wasn't just conflicted about his choices, but was literally being inhabited by multiple competing identities, each one trying to assert dominance, neither one complete enough to fully control him. The episodes increased in frequency as I spent more time in proximity to the Supreme Leader. Sometimes they were subtle, just moments where his body language would shift mid-conversation, where his tone would change between sentences, where he'd start speaking with one emotional affect and finish with a completely different one. Other times they were dramatic, violent, the Supreme Leader destroying furniture or equipment, while arguing with voices only he could hear, commanding invisible presences to leave him alone, pleading with entities that weren't physically present to stop pulling at him. The crew learned to evacuate corridors when they heard him coming during these episodes, learned to pretend they hadn't witnessed anything afterward, learned that the Supreme Leader's conflict was something you survived rather than something you addressed. I started documenting patterns. The episodes occurred most frequently after force-intensive activities like interrogations or combat. They intensified when Supreme Leader Ren was in the presence of objects connected to his past, particularly anything related to his family or his time at Luke Skywalker's temple. They seemed to follow a tidal rhythm, waxing and waning like something was orbiting through his consciousness, sometimes distant enough that he could function normally, sometimes so close that it overwhelmed his ability to maintain a coherent identity. And most disturbingly, the episodes showed signs of external intelligence, of the competing impulses being directed by something outside himself, rather than arising from internal psychology. I discovered this during an incident in the Supreme Leader's meditation chamber, where I'd been summoned to deliver an operational report that couldn't wait. I entered to find him kneeling before Vader's helmet, not wearing his own mask, his back to me. I started to announce myself, but stopped when I heard him speaking, his voice raw and unprocessed by the vocoder. He was saying, "I'm not strong enough to resist both of you. One of you has to let go, please. I can't be the grandson you need and the son they remember. I can't serve the dark and honor the light. I can't be Kylo Ren and Ben Solo simultaneously. One of you has to let me go." The air in the chamber grew cold, that particular cold that accompanies dark side presence, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice, not spoken aloud, but somehow audible anyway, coming from everywhere and nowhere, saying, "You are mine. I claimed you when you were still in the womb. Your grandfather's power flows through you because I allow it. You serve me whether you accept it or not." The voice was ancient, patient, utterly certain. It felt like it was coming from the helmet, or through the helmet, or maybe the helmet was just a focus point for something that existed in a different dimension than the physical. Then the temperature changed, became warmer, and I felt a different presence, something that made me want to weep without understanding why, something that felt like losing people you loved and knowing they still loved you, despite the loss. A second voice, equally impossible, equally real, said, "You are not his. You were born from love, not from power. The light that sustains all life claims you, has always claimed you, will never release you regardless of what path you choose. Come home. You can still come home." This voice seemed to come from everywhere the dark side presence wasn't, filling the spaces between atoms, resonating in frequencies that physical sound couldn't reach. Supreme Leader Ren was shaking, his fists clenched, his head bowed. He said, "I didn't choose either of you. I chose myself. I chose Kylo Ren, not Vader's legacy and not Luke's failure. I chose the Supreme Leader of the First Order. I chose power without the Sith's dogma and freedom without the Jedi's chains. Why can't I just be that? Why won't you both let me be that?" His voice was desperate, exhausted, the voice of someone who'd been fighting the same battle for years without rest, without hope of victory, without any possibility of peace. The two presences didn't respond in words, but their conflict intensified. The temperature in the chamber fluctuating wildly, the air pressure making my ears pop. The Force presence becoming so heavy that I fell to my knees without meaning to. And Supreme Leader Ren screamed, not in rage or pain, but in pure, frustrated despair. The scream of someone being torn in two by incompatible demands. Someone trying to forge a third path while being dragged in opposite directions by forces he couldn't resist. The scream ended abruptly when he noticed me, his eyes widening, his hand moving toward his lightsaber. For a moment, I thought he'd kill me for witnessing this, for seeing him vulnerable, for hearing what the Supreme Leader of the First Order said when he thought he was alone with his conflict. But he didn't ignite the saber. He just stared at me, his face, so young without the mask, so tired, so profoundly afraid, showing emotions that propaganda hollows never captured. He said, "You heard them." It wasn't a question. I nodded, still kneeling, not trusting myself to stand. He said, "Report that to General Hux, and I'll kill you before the day ends. Report it to anyone, and you'll disappear into interrogation cells you didn't know existed. Do you understand?" I nodded again. He put his mask back on, his posture changing instantly, becoming the Supreme Leader rather than the frightened young man I'd just witnessed. He said, "Deliver your report, then forget this happened. That's not a request." I delivered my report, left the chamber, and immediately went to my quarters to document everything in my observation log before the details faded. But I didn't forget. I couldn't forget. I'd heard the voices, felt the presences, witnessed firsthand that Supreme Leader Ren's conflict wasn't metaphorical or psychological, but was actually two vast cosmic forces fighting for ownership of one human being, neither willing to release their claim, both certain they had the right to control him, the light pulling him toward redemption, sacrifice, connection, the dark pulling him toward domination, isolation, power, and Kylo Ren himself, trapped between them, trying desperately to forge an identity that belonged to neither, but being torn apart by their competing demands. The observation logs I was supposed to file started becoming more difficult to write. How do you clinically describe someone whose conflict isn't about choice, but about survival? How do you document that your Supreme Leader is less a person making decisions than a battleground where reality-warping forces wage war through him? How do you explain to command staff who've never felt the force that their Supreme Leader experiences every moment as a fight for control of his own mind, his own body, his own identity against entities that predate the First Order and the Empire and the Republic by millennia? I started writing 2 logs, the official version clinical and careful, documenting mood variations and command effectiveness without mentioning the impossible things I'd witnessed. And a private version, honest and terrified, recording everything I saw and felt and understood about what was actually happening to Supreme Leader Ren. The private log is what I'm drawing from now, what I'm transcribing into this testimony before they reassign me and classify my knowledge and ensure I never speak about this to anyone. The Supreme Leader's conflict manifested in his command decisions in ways that made tactical sense only if you understood he wasn't operating from a single coherent strategic vision. He'd order operations with dark-side ruthlessness, destroy the planet, execute the prisoners, burn the villages, and then cancel them at the last moment, substituting targeted strikes that minimized civilian casualties. He'd advocate for total war against the resistance, and then personally ensure captured resistance fighters received medical treatment and fair trials before execution. He'd rage against mercy as weakness and then risk entire operations to recover wounded First-Order personnel who should have been abandoned by any rational military calculus. The command staff thought he was indecisive or unstable, but I understood he was fighting battles inside his own decision-making process, one part of him making choices aligned with the dark side's logic, another part countermanding them according to light side principles, and Kylo Ren himself trying to find some third option that satisfied neither but let him maintain the illusion of autonomous control. Every command decision was a compromise between three competing wills, and the results were strategically inconsistent because they were trying to serve incompatible objectives simultaneously. I watched this play out most clearly during the operation in the Wraith system. We'd tracked a resistance cell to a civilian station, confirmed their presence, verified they were using the civilian population as cover. Standard First-Order protocol would be orbital bombardment, destroy the station, eliminate the resistance presence along with everyone else. Supreme Leader Ren initially ordered exactly that, his voice cold and certain, through his mask's vocoder, but then he paused, went rigid in that way I'd learned to recognize, and when he spoke again his tone had changed slightly. He ordered a boarding operation instead, commando teams to extract the resistance operatives with minimal civilian casualties, an operation that would cost First-Order lives but preserve the station's population. General Hux objected, citing the operational costs, the risk to our forces, the inefficiency of selective targeting when overwhelming force could achieve the objective without exposing our troops to danger. Supreme Leader Ren listened to the objection, and I watched his body language flicker between aggressive and defensive postures, saw his hands clench and unclench around his lightsaber. When he responded, his voice did that thing where it seemed like two people speaking at once, saying, "We will proceed with the boarding operation. The First Order is not the Empire. We don't rule through terror of indiscriminate destruction. We rule through demonstration of superior force, applied with precision. Execute the operation as ordered." The operation succeeded tactically but cost us 17 commandos and a shuttle. The resistance operatives were captured. The station's population was grateful rather than hostile, and the propaganda value of the operation exceeded the military cost. But I understood it hadn't been a calculated decision. It had been a compromise between the part of Supreme Leader Ren that wanted to obliterate everything connected to the resistance and the part that couldn't bear to kill innocents, with Kylo Ren himself trying to frame the result as intentional strategic planning rather than admitting he'd ceded control of the decision to whichever internal voice had been loudest in that moment. The pattern repeated across dozens of operations, brutality alternating with mercy, terror alternating with restraint, dark side philosophy implemented with light side modifications, and through it all, Supreme Leader Ren's increasing exhaustion, the visible toll of maintaining coherence while being torn between incompatible imperatives, the growing signs that he was losing the fight to remain himself rather than becoming a puppet, manipulated by forces that cared nothing for his survival. I witnessed the worst episode during a confrontation with a captured Resistance pilot. Supreme Leader Ren had personally interrogated the pilot using force techniques to extract information, and something about the prisoner's mind had triggered one of his episodes. I was summoned to the interrogation chamber afterward, asked to document what had occurred for operational records, and found Supreme Leader Ren standing over the unconscious pilot, trembling, his mask removed, blood running from his nose. He looked at me when I entered, his eyes unfocused, and said in a voice that didn't sound like his own, "I saw myself through his eyes. He didn't see a supreme leader or a dark side warrior or even a threat. He saw a broken child playing dress-up in his grandfather's shadow, performing cruelty because he thinks that's what strength looks like, too weak to choose light and too frightened to fully embrace dark. He pitied me, and the worst part is that he was right." The voice shifted, became harsher, and Supreme Leader Ren said, "He was wrong. He was Resistance propaganda made flesh. They want to believe I can be saved, that there's still Ben Solo somewhere inside waiting to come home. But Ben Solo is dead. I killed him. Kylo Ren is what remains." Then the voice shifted again, became younger, more desperate. "Except I didn't kill him. He's still here. He's always still here. And I can't make him stop hoping, stop remembering, stop pulling me back toward the light, even though the light rejected me, even though Luke tried to kill me, even though the Jedi Order is dead and deserved to die." I stood there listening to Supreme Leader Ren have a three-way conversation with himself, each voice using his mouth, each identity trying to assert dominance, none of them able to maintain control for more than a few seconds. This wasn't psychological conflict. This was literal fragmentation, the Supreme Leader's consciousness being torn into pieces that could barely communicate with each other, let alone integrate into a functional whole. And underlying it all, I felt those presences again, the light and dark sides of the Force using him as their battleground, pulling at him like children fighting over a toy, neither caring that they were destroying what they claimed to want. The episode ended when Supreme Leader Ren collapsed, unconscious before he hit the floor. I called medical, reported it as exhaustion from force exertion, and watched the medical droid stabilize him while carefully not commenting on the fact that force techniques shouldn't cause this kind of physiological trauma. The pilot was transferred to a detention facility and never interrogated by Supreme Leader Ren again. I filed a report noting the Supreme Leader's elevated stress levels and recommending reduced interrogation duties until his condition improved. General Hux read the report, looked at me with an expression that suggested he knew exactly what I wasn't saying, and approved the recommendation without comment. But the episodes didn't improve. They intensified, became more frequent, more violent, more clearly beyond the Supreme Leader's control. I documented instances of him arguing with empty rooms, commanding invisible entities to release him, pleading with voices that only he could hear. I recorded the way his body language would shift between personalities mid-sentence, the way his combat style would alternate between disciplined Jedi forms and chaotic, dark-side aggression, the way he'd give orders and then countermand them seconds later as if a different person had taken control and disagreed with the previous decision. The breaking point came during our pursuit of the Resistance fleet. Supreme Leader Ren was aboard his command ship, coordinating the attack, when he received word that General Organa was aboard one of the fleeing vessels. I was present on the bridge, monitoring his psychological state as ordered, when he was given the option to fire on her ship. I watched him reach for the firing controls, his hand steady, his body language committed to the decision. This was the moment the dark side wanted, the ultimate rejection of his past, the final severance of familial bonds that the dark side philosophy demands. But his hand froze over the controls, just stopped, trembling like it belonged to someone else, like the Supreme Leader's will and his body's actions had become disconnected. Through his mask, I heard breathing that sounded like sobbing, though the vocoder tried to process it as normal respiration. He said, "I can do this. I have to do this. The past has to die." But his hand wouldn't move, couldn't move, was being held back by something stronger than his conscious will. Then his escort fighters fired instead, and the moment passed, and his mother's ship was destroyed by someone else's decision. But I saw Supreme Leader Ren's reaction, saw him collapse against the console, saw his hand move to his chest, like he'd been shot, even though no weapon had been fired at him. And I understood that the light side presence had won that particular battle, had physically prevented him from pulling the trigger, had asserted control over his body to stop him from committing the act that would have fully bound him to the dark side. Except his mother's ship wasn't destroyed. It was disabled and she survived. And Supreme Leader Ren knew she survived because he could feel her through the Force, could sense her presence continuing when it should have ended. And the relief that crossed his face was immediately replaced by horror, by the realization that he'd been glad she survived, that the part of him that was still Ben Solo had won, that he'd failed the test the dark side had set for him. The episode that followed was the worst I'd witnessed. Supreme Leader Ren retreated to his chambers and destroyed everything, furniture, equipment, his own belongings, while screaming at entities that weren't visible but were definitely present. I heard him through the walls, heard him raging against the light side for not letting him complete his transformation, heard him pleading with the dark side to give him the strength to finish what he'd started, heard him crying that he just wanted to be Kylo Ren without the constant battle between Ben Solo and Darth Vader's legacy, without the perpetual conflict that was tearing him apart. I filed my report. I documented the psychological break, the need for intervention, the assessment that Supreme Leader Ren was no longer fit for command without significant psychiatric support. And I waited for the response that never came, because the First Order couldn't acknowledge that their Supreme Leader was falling apart, couldn't admit that the figurehead they'd built their movement around was being destroyed by forces they didn't understand and couldn't control. Instead, they reassigned me. Effective immediately, new posting to a listening station in the unknown regions, isolated duty far from the Supreme Leader's presence, far from the knowledge I'd accumulated, far from anyone I might tell about what I'd witnessed. The orders came through with commendations for my service, promises of future advancement, all the standard language that meant I'd seen too much and needed to be quietly removed from positions where that knowledge could become problematic. I have 3 days before my transport departs, 3 days to transcribe these observations into a format that might survive classification and erasure, 3 days to record what I learned about the inner conflict that tears Kylo Ren between light and darkness, what it actually means when someone is pulled between the Force's opposing sides, what it costs to be the battleground where cosmic powers wage war. The truth is that Kylo Ren doesn't have an inner conflict in any normal sense. He has an invasion. His consciousness is being occupied by external forces that use him as their instrument, that fight through him, that care nothing for his survival or sanity or individual will. The light side claims him because of his bloodline, because he was born from love, because the Force itself recognizes him as important to whatever balance it seeks to maintain. The dark side claims him because of his power, because his anger and pain and fear make him a perfect vessel, because Snoke or Vader's legacy or something older has marked him as belonging to the darkness. And Kylo Ren himself, the actual person, the young man who was Ben Solo and became something else and now can't be either, is trapped between them. He tried to choose the dark side, tried to commit fully to being Sith in everything but name, tried to kill the light side presence inside himself through acts of cruelty and darkness. But the light won't release him, physically stops him from completing acts that would fully bind him to darkness, manifests as intrusive compassion and unwanted mercy and persistent hope that he desperately wishes he could eliminate. He tried to choose the light side too earlier, before I knew him, when he was Luke Skywalker's student trying to be a Jedi. But the dark side was already inside him, inherited or implanted or just attracted to his pain, and it manifested as rage and fear and the seductive promise that power could solve everything if he'd just stop trying to be good and accept what he really was. So he tried to choose neither, tried to be Kylo Ren, separate from both legacies, the supreme leader of the First Order, operating outside the binary of light and dark, forging his own path through sheer will. But you can't forge your own path when two cosmic forces are pulling you in opposite directions, when your body and mind are being used as instruments in a war that's been ongoing since before the galaxy had civilizations. You just get torn apart, gradually, your identity fragmenting under the strain of trying to maintain coherence while being pulled toward incompatible extremes. The inner conflict that tears Kylo Ren between light and darkness isn't noble or dramatic or even particularly interesting from a narrative perspective. It's just horrifying. It's watching someone being destroyed by forces they can't control, can't escape, can't even fully understand. It's seeing a young man who wanted to be strong become a puppet, fighting for autonomy against the strings that control him. It's witnessing someone fragment in real time, their identity shattering into incompatible pieces that can barely coordinate enough to maintain basic function. And the worst part is that there's no resolution possible. He can't choose the light because the dark won't let him, physically stops him, manifests as anger and fear whenever he tries to act with compassion or mercy. He can't choose the dark because the light won't let him, physically stops him, manifests as conscience and connection whenever he tries to commit to cruelty or domination. And he can't choose neither because both sides have claimed him, both insist on their right to control him, both use him as their battleground, regardless of what he wants. The only options are madness, death, or eternal conflict. Madness when the fragmentation becomes too severe for any coherent identity to exist. Death when the strain of being torn apart exceeds his physical capacity to survive. Or eternal conflict, continuing forever, being perpetually torn between light and darkness, without rest, without peace, without any hope that the battle will ever end. I think Supreme Leader Ren knows this. I think that's what I saw in his eyes during that episode, in the interrogation chamber. The knowledge that there's no path forward, no way to win, no possibility of becoming a stable, unified person ever again. I think that's why he destroys equipment and kills subordinates and screams at entities that only he can perceive. Not because he's choosing cruelty, but because he's drowning in the impossibility of his situation, and violence is the only outlet available for the accumulated pressure of being used as an instrument in a war he never asked to fight. The Resistance believes they can save him, that there's still Ben Solo inside waiting to come home, that love and compassion and the light side's power can redeem anyone willing to accept redemption. They're wrong. Not because redemption isn't possible, but because the person they want to save is being destroyed by the process of trying to resist the dark side's claim. Every moment he fights against the darkness, the light side presence grows stronger, exerts more control, takes more of his autonomy. Every moment he tries to embrace the darkness, the light side stops him, prevents him from achieving the commitment that might let him find peace in full corruption. The First Order believes he's their supreme leader, strong and certain and committed to their cause, embodying the power and authority necessary to forge a new galactic order. They're wrong too. He's not leading them. He's barely maintaining enough coherence to pretend to be a leader, performing the role of supreme leader, while internally fighting battles that have nothing to do with the First Order's objectives. They follow someone who doesn't exist in any stable sense, who's more a title than a person, who could fragment completely at any moment if the light and dark sides ever stop balancing each other and one achieves total dominance. And Kylo Ren himself believes he can forge his own path, that he can be neither Jedi nor Sith but something new, that his will is strong enough to resist both the light and dark side's claims on him. He's the most wrong of all. There is no third path when cosmic forces have chosen you as their battleground. There's only survival, moment to moment, fighting to maintain any sense of self while being torn between incompatible imperatives. The path he's forging isn't leading anywhere. It's just the thrashing of someone drowning, the desperate attempt to breathe while being pulled under by currents too powerful to resist. I don't know what will happen to him. I'll be gone before any resolution occurs, posted to some isolated facility where I can't observe him anymore, can't document the progression of his fragmentation, can't witness whether he eventually achieves stability or collapses completely. But I know what I've seen. I know what the inner conflict that tears Kylo Ren between light and darkness actually looks like when you're close enough to witness it. And I know that anyone who thinks it's a simple struggle between good and evil, between redemption and damnation, between choosing right and choosing wrong, hasn't seen what I've seen. It's not a struggle, it's an occupation. It's being invaded by forces that use you without consent, that fight through you without concern for your survival, that claim ownership of your identity and your will and your fundamental existence. It's being torn apart slowly, day by day, moment by moment, by the cosmic war between light and darkness that's been ongoing since the Force first split into opposing aspects. And there's no winning that war when you're the battlefield. There's only enduring it for as long as you can maintain coherence, and then fragmenting, and then whatever comes after fragmentation, when the person you were stops existing and all that remains is the conflict itself, still fighting, still tearing apart whatever's left, until there's nothing but light and darkness occupying the same space where a human being used to be. I hope he finds peace. I hope somehow, despite everything I've witnessed, despite the impossibility of his situation, despite the cosmic forces that have claimed him, Kylo Ren finds a way to become one coherent person again, instead of remaining the battleground for powers that will never release him. But I don't believe he will. I've seen too much. I've felt the presence of the light and dark sides fighting through him. I've watched him fragment in real time, watched his identity splinter under pressures that no human being should have to withstand. The inner conflict that tears Kylo Ren between light and darkness isn't going to resolve. It's going to consume him, and someday, maybe soon, maybe after years more of struggling, the young man who was Ben Solo and became Kylo Ren will stop existing entirely. All that will remain is the conflict itself. Light and dark fighting through the empty vessel that used to be a person, neither side winning, neither side losing, both locked in eternal war over territory that's already been destroyed by their battle. That's what I witnessed during my 73 days assigned to Supreme Leader Ren's personal detail. That's what I'm recording before they ship me off to the unknown regions and classify my observations and ensure this knowledge never reaches anyone who might act on it. That's the truth about the inner conflict that tears Kylo Ren between light and darkness. It's not a choice. It's a destruction. And there's no path forward that doesn't end in the total erasure of whoever Kylo Ren actually is beneath the conflict that's consuming him. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that somehow, despite everything I've seen, he finds a way to survive this, but I don't believe he will. The conflict that tears him apart is too powerful, too ancient, too fundamentally incompatible with the existence of a coherent human identity. He's being destroyed by cosmic forces that care nothing for his survival. And all any of us can do is watch it happen and document what we see and hope that somehow someone learns something from the tragedy of a young man who was torn apart by powers that should never have claimed a human being as their battleground. This is my testimony. This is what I witnessed. This is the truth about the inner conflict that tears Kylo Ren between light and darkness. It's not what anyone wants to believe, but it's what I saw, and it's the most important thing I'll ever record, even if no one ever reads it, even if it gets classified and buried and forgotten. Someone needs to know what actually happened to Ben Solo, what he became, what destroyed him. Someone needs to know that the conflict isn't a choice, it's an invasion, and he's losing.